In a previous video, I mentioned that you learn Photoshop the same way you would eat an elephant, one bite at a time. So it's time to take a couple more bites. We're going to be talking about adding contrast locally using Photoshop and utilizing layers and layer masks to blend multiple moments together to help a composition. Let's jump into it. One of my favorite techniques when I'm shooting seascapes is to rattle off a bunch of images as a wave rolls in or rolls out or crashes over rocks. And the reason for that is because you don't really know which moment you're going to want to use or which moment looks best in the composition. And sometimes, especially if you're shooting on a tripod, you can blend multiple waves or splashes or moments together and fill out the composition a little better. So in this scene, I was shooting on a tripod. You can see down here that I have a whole bunch of images, same exact composition. And I really liked the way that the water was kind of splashing and reaching out down here in the bottom left of the composition. Also, I like that you can see kind of the leading edge of this wave. But a couple seconds later, I got this image where the water was cascading off of these rocks in the background. I love that kind of little mini waterfall look. I really like the way that looks, but I don't like the whitewash of all the other areas of the image. So I want to blend this image and this image together. And it'll be really easy because I held the composition between frames, and that's a really good tip is when you're out photographing something like this where there's some dynamic movement and there's there might be an opportunity to blend multiple moments together. If you are constantly tweaking your composition, you're not going to be able to line things up. But because I held this composition the same for a while, I'm able to blend multiple different moments together. Also, you'll notice that we have a fairly high dynamic range scene. We have really bright sky and really deep, dark shadows in these basalt rock formations. So adding contrast globally is not going to work very well for us. And so we're going to utilize selections in Photoshop to make sure that the contrast is only going where we want it to go. So that's the goal of today's video. Let's jump into it. So the first thing I want to do is level my horizon line because my crooked horizon line is driving me insane. So I grabbed the crop tool and we're just going to tip it down to where it's nice and level. Next thing is I want to get my white balance somewhere around neutral. Right now it's pretty cold, so we're going to warm it up a bit. Not so far that we start getting yellow water, but I want to have some cool tones and warm tones present in the frame. We're also going to open the shadows, open the blacks, recover highlights a little bit, maybe bring down the exposure after doing that. Let's bring up the whites just a little bit so we have some nice highlight contrast. Got to be careful not to allow some of these areas to get too bright, but as I bring up our white slider, we start getting that nice brilliance in the water and that nice contrast that I like. In every single image I ever process, I always tweak my sharpening. So I want to decrease radius, increase detail, and mask out just a little bit of sharpening so we're not sharpening noise in the sky too much. And really important in this scene is going to be removing chromatic aberrations. So I'm going up here and removing chromatic aberrations because around these areas of high contrast, that's definitely where you're going to get that. And also because this is a fairly colorless scene, let's add a little bit of saturation. And I'm going to do that in the camera calibration tab. Grab the saturation slider of the blue primary and bring it to the right just a little. It adds a nice saturation boost, but it also adds a little bit of contrast as well. Also, one other thing I want to do is because we have a little cyan in the sky, I want to go to the HSL panel and we're going to go to the hue and we're going to move the aquas towards blue, just like that. And maybe we'll take the purples, push them towards blue. That way we don't get too much of a purple sky from adding this much magenta. So at this point, I want to sync all of these same settings across to the other frame that we're going to blend in together. And that's going to make sure that they both get the same processing. So we're going to hold down Shift, click on this image number 5, hit sync, check all, and synchronize. That way, both of these images get the exact same treatment from Lightroom. So at this point, we're ready to open these up as layers inside of Photoshop. Now, most of the time, I recommend opening things up as smart objects in Photoshop. But because we're starting with a fairly neutral scene here, and I know I'm not gonna have to do too much crazy stuff inside of Photoshop, we're not dual processing or anything like that, I'm gonna just open these up as layers. It's going to be a little bit easier for this particular case. So I'm gonna right click, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. Okay, so here we are inside of Photoshop. We have our 2 layers here. Now, when I toggle these off and on, you can see that we don't have any movement. All that moves is that water. So that tells me that everything is properly aligned. You always want to check your alignment just in case your tripod got bumped, or maybe you're not shooting on the most stable tripod in the world. We don't have any movement here, and that's going to make everything way, way easier. So what I need to do is put a black layer mask, or at least get it kind of a game plan of what parts of each of the frames I want to use. So for example, in this frame here, I want to use all of this bottom left, and maybe we want to use this background splash as well. But this middle section here, I want to replace with this flow. So what I'm going to do is, let's just put a black layer mask on this top layer, and I'm going to create a new layer mask by clicking the new layer mask button, and then invert that layer mask so it's black. Black conceals, white reveals. So right now this entire layer is being hidden. Now we're going to grab a paintbrush, 100% opacity, 100% flow, and anywhere that I paint white on here is going to be revealing this top layer. This top layer, remember, we're going to bring in here and maybe a little bit into that background. So I'm going to start off with a fairly hard brush, not too soft. And we're going to just start on this bottom left corner. And as I paint in, it's going to reveal that layer. So I remember there was this splash here. There's also a splash here that I wanted to try to reveal. And as I get closer to the parts of this other photo that I want to keep, I have to start being pretty thoughtful about how these transition into each other. So this process is a lot of back and forth, kind of trying to find a nice natural way for those to blend together. Maybe I'll soften my brush a little bit, go back and forth and try to find a transition point that looks natural. Maybe something like that. Out here in this whitewash of the waves, it's a lot easier to find that transition point because there's some margin for error there. So if I just kind of bring this in here, I think that looks pretty natural. And I'm just going back and forth with white and black to kind of go, like when I'm painting with white, it's bringing that in. When I paint with black, it's taking it out. And so I just kind of go back and forth and I try to find a transition point that looks real and looks natural. I think that looks pretty good. Now let's go back here to where this one little splash was. We're going to switch back to white and bring that in and see if we can find a transition that looks right. I think that looks good. Good. So this becomes our new canvas for all of the editing that we're going to do. So the way I like to work is, the first thing I like to do is bring all the pieces together, which we just did. Now I want to start thinking about dynamic range. Like, is the sky too bright? Yes. Step 1 is going to be darkening down that sky a bit. Now, just like in Lightroom, Photoshop has a select sky function, and it's pretty easy to do. So what we can do is I can create a new brightness contrast adjustment layer, which gives us a white layer mask. We can go here, and the first thing that I'm going to do is just make an adjustment, just looking at the sky, bringing it down, adding contrast. So I want to add contrast and darken it down. And I want to do this a little beyond what I want the final result to be. And obviously this global contrast just absolutely ruins these deep shadows, but I think it will allow us to draw the eye lower into the frame, because remember this, the eye is always going to be drawn to bright highlights. So we don't want the brightest highlights to be in the sky. So now what we're going to do is, to start fresh, to start with none of this adjustment showing, we're going to invert this layer mask so it's filled with black. And I do that by going Control or Command I for invert. And so now we have a nice black layer mask. Now what I want to do is, rather than just applying this adjustment to the sky with a selection of the sky, what I want to do is I want to paint through that selection of the sky. And the reason for that is because I want this to kind of be feathered out close to this horizon line. If I just create a selection of the sky and it just stops at that horizon line, there's going to be some weirdness in that transition zone. So what I want to do is we're going to go up to select. Actually, we're going to make sure that we have one of our pixel layers selected. We're going to go up to select sky. And now it's going to make a selection of that sky. We'll know because now we have marching ants here. And now what I want to do is, with this selection active, it's going to function like a stencil when I go to paint. So for example, if I was just to go here, grab a white paintbrush, 100% opacity, and just go, you can see that it's painting in the sky, but it's not painting in our rocks here. So we're going to use this like a stencil. I'm going to hide these marching ants just so I don't have to look at them. I'm going to do that by going Control or Command H for hide. I'm going to go to our black layer mask here. I'm going to lower my opacity to like 70%. And I'm going to use a really big brush. The reason I want a really big brush is because I want the feathered edge of this brush to function kind of like a graduated filter, where it's going to fade out as it gets close to that horizon line. So I want my brush really soft. And that, by the way, you can bring up this little dialog box by right-clicking. So when I right-click, it brings up this box. I can change the size of my brush with the square bracket keys. So when I increase the brush size, it's because I'm hitting the right bracket key. And now I'm going to do a single pass across. And if I like the result of that, I'll do one more across. So before, after, we've just darkened down that sky. And if we look at our layer mask, that sky selection kept this adjustment out of the rocks. And because I was using the feathered edge, it faded out that adjustment as it got close to the horizon line. So we have no weird artifacts or anything like that. We can zoom in and make sure that that selection didn't allow this adjustment to go somewhere it doesn't belong. And it looks good to me. So we can kind of move on. So we just used that selection, that sky selection, as a stencil, painted through it. And then where we chose to paint is where that adjustment is going to go. So we're affecting the area. We're limiting the area that our paint can go with that selection. And then we're using our best judgment on where to paint. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to add just a little bit of highlight contrast to the majority of the photo. And I want this to only affect the highlights, but not so much the shadows. So let's go down and create a levels adjustment layer. So now with this levels adjustment layer, it looks like this. We have a white point slider, a black point slider, and then a midpoint slider. And one of the most basic, easy ways to add contrast in Photoshop is with this levels adjustment, where you grab this right slider, bring it left, grab the midtone slider, take it right. And so we're pushing the midtones darker, but we're brightening the highlights. So when I turn this off and on, you can see that it's affecting those shadows just a little bit, but mostly it's affecting the highlights and the brighter areas. So what I want to do here is we're going to do this. We're going to create this adjustment where we're adding contrast and we're kind of darkening some of those upper midtones. And then we're going to invert the layer mask and just paint it in where it looks good. So I'm going to toggle this off and on, kind of looking at where I like the adjustment. I definitely like it in the water, and I like it in the clouds as well. Maybe we don't have to add it towards the, well, actually, I like it pretty much everywhere except for the rock formations. It's getting a little bit dark over in here. I'm going to fill this layer mask with black by going Control or Command I. And now I'm just simply going to paint this in. It's kind of like if we were working inside of Lightroom, this would be like an adjustment brush. But the cool thing is, if we overdo this, we can just fade it out a little bit. And because it's easily accessible here in our layers panel, it's really easy to find. So with white paintbrush, I've got 60% opacity brush. I'm just going to start painting this in to the areas I felt it looked good. I don't have to be super careful with how I'm applying this simply because it's not a very extreme adjustment. A good rule of thumb is that you want to sneak up on results. You don't want to try to get there all at once. And what I mean by that is if you try to do one adjustment that does everything the image needs, it means that that's going to be a really harsh adjustment. It's much better to do a bunch of small adjustments and sneak up on a result. So before, after, just added a little bit of highlight kick, especially in the water here. Now, if we wanted to open up some of the shadows kind of deeper back into the scene, there's so many different ways we can do it in Photoshop. Honestly, dodging and burning is one of my favorite ways to do it because it feels a little bit more artistic and and you're in full control over where it goes. So a simple dodge burn layer is nothing more than a new layer, which you create with a square with a plus sign in the middle of it. So we have a new blank layer. And in this case, we're just going to switch the blend mode to soft light. This is a simple dodge burn layer inside of Photoshop. Now what we can do is we can either brighten or darken with it, or we can work in color or change the color as well. So whatever color we choose to paint with is going to be subtly worked in as we're brightening or darkening. So for example, one of the ways that I would use this is, let's say that we wanted to add just a little bit of haze into this background. I could do that with just pure white, or I could do it with a slightly more daylight color. So I've got a bright, warm color selected here. I'm going to go to 10% opacity with my brush, so I'm working slow. Let's zoom in. And as I paint this in, you can see that it brightens, it adds kind of a sense of haze, but it also is warming up as well. So if we wanted to emulate the way the daylight is kind of shining through some of the coastal mist, that's exactly how you would do it. We're warming it up and we're emphasizing the atmosphere by not allowing those darkest tones to go all the way to black. By doing that, it makes the foreground more contrasty than the background, and that really emphasizes atmosphere. If I wanted it to be a bit more neutral when I do it, I would just use a white or a gray, a desaturated color. And for example, in this pass, I'm going to hit all of these rocks. So I'm going to paint here and out the side, before, after. You can see it just kind of opened up those shadows, but it did it in a less warm, more neutral kind of way. This essentially is just a dodge burn layer. This is the kind of layer that most photographers do a whole lot of inside of Photoshop. I can do the same thing with any of these areas in the water that I would like to brighten. I could grab just a slightly blue color, just the tiniest bit of blue, very bright, 20% opacity, and anywhere that I paint this, it's going to get just a little bit of extra highlight applied to it. Now, the way I would typically use this is I would work a little bit of extra warmth into these areas that are getting hit with light. So let's, in this case, grab just a little bit of an orangey daylight color. That way, anywhere that I am brightening, I'm also emphasizing the warm daylight that is hitting there. Because after all, that's why these areas are bright and some of the areas are dark, is because they're being hit with daylight. And you need to work with a low opacity if you're not using some kind of selection to guide this. A lot of times my preferred method for doing this is to create a luminosity selection that will function like that stencil, and that will guide me and only allow my paint to go where I want it to go or where it should go. Because you want to be brightening highlights that are being hit with light and leaving the shadow and midtones next to those highlights alone. That way you're increasing the contrast rather than just brightening everything. We could use this same dodge burn layer over here in our rock areas to just brighten some of the areas and maybe make it feel a little bit more three-dimensional. Every three-dimensional object has an area that has a highlight side and a shadow side. And by subtly brightening the highlight side, but leaving the shadow side alone, you're making it appear more three-dimensional. You're emphasizing the light that's hitting it, but leaving the shadow areas alone. Now, these are the kind of adjustments that I would much rather do while utilizing a selection of some kind, but you can still make it work freehand. You just have to be a little bit more careful and zoom further in and really concentrate on what you're doing here. So in this way, we're really controlling contrast. We are controlling where the brightest highlights live. We want it to be in the water because that is the subject. The subject was not the fairly boring sky. The subject was the cool flowing water. And utilizing the layer mask to both blend these layers together and to control where these contrast layers are going is really, really powerful. So hopefully there's some inspiration in here somewhere. And for those of you that are just getting started in Photoshop, hopefully this has given you some ideas on how you can kind of control where the contrast goes. Remember that you want the contrast to only go into the areas that you want it to go. That way you're not damaging other areas of your photo. If we would have added that amount of contrast to the entire photo that we started with in that sky, those rocks would have been destroyed. They would have been what I call innocent bystander pixels. They were just there minding their own business and then wham, got hit with a ton of contrast that they really didn't need. All right, hopefully this helps, guys, and we'll see you in the next video. Take it easy, everybody.